My name is Dave Hollenbach, the host of From Embers to Excellence, a podcast that explores the many facets of leadership from the perspectives of some amazing people. We discuss the triumphs and failures that have shaped our lives and our leadership philosophies. I've found that it isn't whether we fail that defines us, but when we do fail, how we respond. Leaders dust off the ashes and use their failures as fuel to work harder and as lessons to come back wiser and stronger, more resilient, more determined, and more committed to excellence. Today I'm speaking with Jodi Woelkerling. She is the author of World-Class Leadership, soon to be released. After teetering on the edge of burnout, she looked towards building her resilience. On her journey, Jodi became a Success Principles certified trainer, health and life coach, and neuro-linguistic programming practitioner. She has since paired those skills with her corporate knowledge and understanding of leadership. This paved the way for her to help others overcome their resilience challenges and cultural barriers in their workplaces. Thank you so much for allowing me to interview you, Jodi, and you're in Victoria, Australia.
Certainly am. So the southern eastern part of Australia. So thank you for having me on, David.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to, before we get into your book and what you're known for, I wanted to get kind of a feeling for your life growing up, maybe some of your influences. Were you born and raised there in Victoria?
Born in Victoria, travelled around a fair bit as part of my growing up and lived in various parts in Australia. But I kind of ended up in my adulthood going back to Victoria. So yeah.
Nice. And for higher education, can you talk a little bit about that? Maybe the major course of your studies and really your early professional life?
Yeah, so pretty much straight out of secondary school, I took a gap year and then I did a Bachelor of Arts in majoring in sociology and philosophy and psychology. So interesting, many years ago background, and then did a teaching qualification. So unfortunate timing, because when I qualified as a teacher, the same year the Premier, who's the head of our state, closed a lot of schools. So I came out at the end of the teaching qualification where there was a lot of unemployed teachers and very few jobs. So my life ended up going down a different road than secondary teaching. So.
And is that really what led you into the corporate world?
Yes. So what it meant is I went into look for alternative jobs. Basically, my first kind of serious job was as a quality assurance manager, and that was when I don't know if ISO 9000 was big with you guys in America, but I was one of the people when it was big here, basically working on that within a business, which was a great opportunity as a young adult. So yeah, that was working through the business, and they did it as a way of improving all of the systems. So I had quite a lot of, it was a very good foundation for me, collaborating and working with people and getting an idea of the effect of systems and carry-on effects and that sort of stuff. So yeah.
And so that kind of led you into, I'm guessing just by reading some of your bio, you ended up possibly in a managerial role or executive role where you led teams and that sort of thing?
Yeah, so that role was an executive role. It was a quality assurance manager. With that one, I didn't have any staff answering to me, but it was a position of sort of authority and influence and responsibility. So yeah, interesting. As I said, good opportunity as a young adult to actually be able to go through to that sort of role.
Well, what led you toward really the self development that I've read about, and I believe what you've written about in your book? You talk about resilience and really learning how to be more resilient yourself.
So I've held various positions throughout my career, but they were generally positions of authority, responsibility, and often people leading positions. Now, while I could do all of those, for a lot of my career, I really felt in myself the negative effects of stress. And obviously that goes up and down, peaks and troughs as different circumstances and things that happen, but it was a constant through most of my career. So a few years back, I reached a point where I didn't burn out, but I think I was very, very close to it. And I was in a stage where it was, I was in a state of stress, and it was affecting me physically. I had certain physical symptoms. It was affecting things like relationships. It was affecting, there wasn't the stress Jodi and the relaxed Jodi. There was basically this constant on edge. So it was really not a quality of life stage to be in. And it was almost as if that was a light bulb moment for me. I call them light bulb moments, where or aha moments, where you go, something occurs to you that should have occurred to you years before, but it didn't. But it was basically, there has to be something better than this. This is not quality of life. So that started me on a path of really working on myself and going through various educations and self-development to, first of all, find what it was in me and develop myself so that I was in a much better place in myself. And that kind of progressed from there to helping other people, and then helping leaders and helping businesses.
And part of the introduction, I introduce you as a Success Principles certified trainer. What it seems like the Success Principles is maybe a certifying organization.
So are you familiar with Jack Canfield?
I know that name. I'm not really familiar with what he does.
Most people, if you say chicken soup for the soul, they go, ah. So he and Mark Victor Hansen are the chicken soup for the soul guys. But Jack is also very well known for, he has a book, The Success Principles, which is one of the best books I've ever read. And in my development, that was one of the early ones that I read and went, my gosh, there are some huge insights in this. And when he talks about stress, people think, sorry, not stress, about success, people think success around making money and positions of power and all that sort of stuff. He doesn't look at it that way. It can be that, but it's your definition of where you want your life to be. He classes that as success. So to me, it's self-development and self-empowerment is kind of the core message of it. So as I said, I read the book and kind of went, this is fantastic, give me more. And then did the course where I became certified in training it. So it's based on Jack Canfield was the main teacher, and it's based on his success principles. So yeah.
And what exactly is a neuro-linguistic programming practitioner?
Good question. So this is an area that a lot of life coaches have studied in. It's basically working on, so the neuro is brain and linguistic is language. So it's a lot of processes and a philosophy that works to a lot of that subconscious part of the brain, a lot of automatic things that people do that they aren't aware of. And it goes from very simple things like, gosh, what's one of the simple things that it went through? Eye patterns. So when people are processing, and if you watch their eyes dart to various areas depending on what part of the brain that they're using. So awareness around that sort of stuff. To some of the really more complicated things, like, so one of the areas that we learnt was working through some serious childhood traumas, or basically the origin of behaviors or emotions in your life that you don't want to be a constant factor, and working through processes to get to the subconscious origin of that, with the idea of basically getting to it and overturning the effect of it on your life later on. It's really quite fascinating. And as it goes from very basic things, and I don't want to be constantly eating ice cream, so you do certain patterns to stop you having that craving and that sort of stuff. But it uses language and goes to the subconscious neuro part of the brain. It's quite interesting.
In your work right now, when you are helping individuals or organizations develop resilience, what do you specifically define resilience as?
It's such a good place to define, because how do we know what we're working towards unless we have a definition of it? So I look at resilience as two main parts of it. So here I'm talking primarily about personal resilience. So the first part is staying calm in yourself as much as possible when things, because we all have stresses in our life, when stresses happen, to stay calm as much as possible. And there's various things that you can do in your life to help you enhance that kind of well-being. But the other side of it is there's very few people in the world that live in that state of zen and peace 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, very few. So we nearly all have things that cause us stresses, things that we're dealing with that are carryovers from years ago. Basically working with people in, okay, if they are feeling stressed, one, recognizing that as quickly as possible, because I think self-awareness is kind of halfway there. If you're not aware of it, you can't do much about overturning it or working towards something better. So awareness around it, and then how to bring yourself back to that calm, in control, logical state as quickly as possible. So that's from a personal point of view. From leaders, very much it's the same thing. Leaders need to develop their personal resilience. They're an individual like anybody else. And from an organizational point of view, it's around working on things that have been known to cause stress in their staff, and working on basically systems, processes, education, development and leaders, that sort of stuff, so that those are minimized or removed, so that the staff don't experience the stresses anywhere near as much.
And how do you consciously and systematically build resilience into culture? Because you're talking about working with leadership and their staff. For those behaviors that you teach them, for them to stick, you've got to really work towards shifting the culture so that it kind of everybody supports one another. But how do you reach that level?
Yeah, such a good question. The first step always with businesses is to get a really accurate picture of what's going on, because there's certain patterns and certain things that cause problems and certain things that that help address that. But how that manifests and what the problems are for each organization is different. So the first step is to really get an accurate picture of what's going on. Now, most businesses traditionally do that through things like engagement surveys. That is part of the toolkit, but is nowhere near the full toolkit, because there's certain issues with engagement surveys around people not being really honest for various reasons in their wording. the way, even the wording of the questions can make an enormous difference to the outcome that you get. So so engagement surveys, I basically, in getting a snapshot of businesses, you look at qualitative stuff and quantitative stuff. So engagement surveys definitely fits under the quantitative. Other things under the quantitative are general patterns within the business. So things like staff turnover, things like productivity statistics. A lot of the time it's quantitative stuff that businesses collect and know already. The qualitative side is often where the real insights, in my opinion, come from. So that is having very in-depth conversations with key people in the business. And that's not just your C-suite, CEO, CFO, higher end of the business, but basically people throughout the whole organization, in a situation with a practitioner where there is a level of trust and anonymity. And often those conversations are where you get some of the best insights of what's actually going on. What are the pain points? What are the stresses? What's actually going on in this organization? And even doing things like observations. So watching a team and watching the dynamics of how they relate to each other. And most people, it's a strange concept for people, but if you say, okay, you've walked into a room, whether that's family, friends, work, whatever, and they've 2 minutes before you walked in had a big argument. Most people will pick up, I call it the vibes, pick up the vibes of that. So observations will often pick up the vibes of what's actually going on within the team dynamic if you really pay attention to how people relate to each other, what tones they use, body language, how they relate to customers, all sorts of things. So the first snapshot with businesses is always to work out what's actually going on and what are the pain points. Because again, if, as I said, in terms of personal stuff, if you don't know what the problem is, you can't really address it. So, and then there's various ways of kind of addressing it once you know what's going on.
When you define work-related resilience, how do you differentiate or support larger systemic issues versus an individual's ability to self-care or provide self-maintenance?
Yep, they're both important, simply because the individual within the organisation, the more sort of centered and resilient they are in themselves, the better they handle the things that are going on. But it's almost like the individual, it's about working one-on-one with that individual, or in training and dealing with teaching them around what are some of the things that happen from an individual managing your own resilience point of view. From a business at large point of view, again, it's normally systematic and more widespread. So it's patterns. So that could be patterns throughout the whole organization. It could be patterns in certain teams or departments. So it's more global, and you can pick the difference because just say, for example, there's a team of 10 people, and there is one particular person in the team who is consistently feeling stressed. That's sort of something to work on with that individual person. If you have a team of 10 people and you have certain patterns that are emerging, so just say high absenteeism, or a drop in productivity over time, or various things, that's when patterns, and that's when you're talking about there's a larger scale cultural, organizational, team-based problem. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Yeah. And when you're working with companies and you're identifying these patterns that you're going to address, what are some of the major behaviors or workplace norms that you come across that you identify as problematic that you need to address directly?
Yeah, so there's quite a lot of them. Probably the one of the most common ones and one of the most impactful ones is psychological safety, whether it's there or not. And it's a bit of a buzz term that you hear at the moment, but most people kind of go, yes, that's important, but kind of don't know a lot about it. So psychological safety is a culture where people feel safe to voice their opinion, even if that opinion is different to everybody else or different to their leader or whatever. People feel safe to innovate. So to think, is there a better way of doing this? Is there a new product? Is there a new process? Is there a new whatever? They feel safe to learn and develop themselves. So that can be through education, or it can be trying a different role that they didn't previously do. So basically developing themselves. With developing yourself, there's always a risk of not doing something as well as the next person, or failing at it, or having to persist over a period of time before you become competent. Where you have a situation where people feel safe to do all of those things, you get those results. You get innovation, you get collaboration, you get productivity, you get people putting up their hand to develop and try new things. And the opposite of that is there's not psychological safety. You get people almost siloing themselves and being in protective mode. So they will only do or say or behave in a way that feels safe. And it's an almost natural human instinct. So there's lots of others, but psychological safety is a big one because it makes an enormous difference in the organization and how the team and the culture works.
Do you have any other examples of problems that you and your team address?
Yep. So simple things like people want to feel that they are supported, valued, and cared for. It sounds so simple, but having either as an individual leader point of view or as an organizational point of view, ways that you can develop almost undercurrent of care and support makes an enormous difference. And it's one of those things that can be derailed very quickly and takes a long time to build up. Other things are things like people at their core, whether they sort of consciously realize it in themselves or not, they want to be part of a bigger purpose. And this is kind of labeled now as almost a millennial or younger thing, but I would actually disagree with that. It's pretty much all age groups. People want to be part of a bigger purpose. And if you have a bigger purpose in your organization, it pretty much helps engagement and helps people to realize that I'm part of a larger greater purpose. And it's funny, people go, well, hang on, I it's a business example. We work as a hardware store selling hardware parts. Why is me working as the person who restocks shelves? Why is that a purposeful thing? Just as an example. But really, if it is spelled out, what's the greater purpose? Well, it could be with something like a hardware store. We help empower people to be able to create their environment in the way that they want, and to develop their skills in working on that in a way that is cost effective and educational. I've got pick that out of my brain, as opposed to we sell nails and screws.
Right.
So really defining that purpose, and that purpose being a key part of the ongoing culture of the business, becomes extremely important, because as I said, whether people realize it or not, they want to be part of a bigger purpose, and they want to know that their role in that purpose is important. It's very easy for people to forget that. But the bottom line is, in pretty much any organization, unless your role is important, you wouldn't be there doing it. So as I said, the hardware store example, the person who stocks the shelves, well, why is that important? Well, it means that the next time customer X walks and wants to buy part Y, it's sitting here on the shelf waiting for them. It sounds really simple, but a lot of this stuff is really simple, but it's quite often missed. So, and yeah, there's all sorts of the way people relate to each other, things like people having a feeling of security in their business, people feeling that there's a work-life balance and some sort of understanding of where their work fits in the rest of their life, realistic demands. So that's demands in terms of time or performance indicators, all that sort of stuff. So yeah, there's a lot of them that can make an enormous difference.
Now, I'm wondering, early on in your career, or well, what led you on this journey to develop your own resilience? At that time, when you were approaching burnout, did you feel as though you were being supported by the organization you were working for?
Well, that's dangerous, because there's people who know at that stage. Reality, no. It's just dangerous because there's people I'm still in contact with who are involved at that stage.
Well,
No.
the reason I ask is because I feel as though a lot of organizations with turnaround, you'll find that those people that are leaving the organization were either approaching burnout themselves, had reached burnout, or had witnessed their peers experiencing burnout and could readily identify the similarities, like, well, if I stick around as long as they have, I'm going to be just like that. So they find someplace else. Now, a lot of that is when people don't feel as though they're being supported, they don't feel valued, they don't have the resources that are available in the industry to help them do their job more efficiently. Those kind of things that show, like, yes, your job matters to us, you're valuable, we want you to have all of the best tools to make life easier on you. And if you need help with whatever, if you need somebody, an assistant or a team or whatever it may be, if those resources are provided, that is a tangible event or process, or just something tangible that the business provides for the employees. And you end up with what you were talking about, people that feel like they're a part of something bigger than them. And you get more buy-in and more productivity. And
It
less
sounds so
burnout.
simple, doesn't it? But so many organizations miss it. But you're absolutely correct. And the thing is, one thing that you said there, I'd like to highlight is that if people feel, so when they're in those positions where they're feeling not in a great state, and that can be stress, it can be family issues, it can be health, it can be a whole range of things. If they're not feeling great and they are supported through that, you end up generally with engaged, loyal employees. And you will also end up with engaged, loyal employees by the people who witness what's going on. So an example that I've seen in the past with this was a lady who had cancer, had to take time off work basically for cancer treatment. And she said down the track, she said the only time they really checked on me was basically to find out when I'd be well enough to come to work. She said I felt so uncared for and unsupported in that process. So it disengaged her, and it disengaged everybody else who saw it or she had relationships within in the business. And it's not rocket science, but it is so often missed.
So when you're coaching individuals that are in an environment like that and they're approaching burnout, how do you coach them in developing their own personal resilience?
Yep. So I work with people on 3 levels, and I find level 1 and level 2 apply to pretty much anyone, and level 3 is applies to most people, but definitely to people who have stress as a repeated issue in their life. So level 1 is if you are feeling stressed, recognizing it in yourself. And there are certain processes or things that you can do that go straight to the physiological response of stress, because stress is actually, there's a lot of physiological things that happen. Goes straight to the physiological reaction to stress and helps overturn it. So they're often very quick and easy to learn, and people find them quite fun to learn. So things like belly breathing is probably the most common one that works for more people than any of the others. None of them work for everybody. It's an individual kind of thing, but nearly everybody will find something that works for them, if that makes sense. So deep belly breathing is you basically sit upright and you breathe from the bottom of your lungs, and you can tell you're doing that because your belly goes in and out when you breathe. And if you're breathing from the top of your lungs, which is not what you want, your shoulders generally go up and down. So you want your shoulders to stay still, belly goes in and out, and you breathe at a very slow pattern. The pattern that I normally recommend to people is in for 4, out for 6, and you repeat that for a couple of minutes. And it sounds so simple, but it actually goes to that physiological response, to that automatic physiological response. It overturns it and helps bring you back to that state of calm. And there's other ones. So things like the one that works the best on me is this one. So you're basically almost giving yourself a rub and a hug. And I can feel the effect on that in me just doing that. So, and there's a whole group of other ones that go to the physiology of resetting that stress response. So that's the first level. The second level is there are certain lifestyle things and certain mindset things that make an enormous difference in stresses in your life and whether they affect you and the extent. So the 3 basics that make an enormous difference are sleep, diet, and exercise. Sleep's probably the best example, because sleep's one of those things most people can relate. If they're feeling stressed, normally their sleep is affected. And the opposite is true. If they're not getting great sleep, they're normally more susceptible to feel the effects of stresses in their life. So the lifestyle stuff, so as I said, sleep, diet, and exercise, things like connections and relationships, work-life balance, finding time to do things that you love. There's a whole range of lifestyle things that make a difference. And mindset, there's ways that you by default think and process things about yourself and the world, and mindset can make an enormous difference in how you deal with different stresses or situations. So that's level 2. Level 3 is when I'm working one-on-one with clients whose stress is a major repeated issue. This is where we spend the bulk of our time. And this is working on the subconscious things that mean that you are more susceptible to feeling the effects of stresses on your life. So they are the things that subconscious means people generally aren't aware of them. And they'll often go back to things that have happened in the formative years of your life, especially the first 7 years of your life. And it can be fairly serious things, but it can also be not very serious things. What I mean by that is it could be, I don't know, your your first grade teacher made an offhand remark about you not being very smart. So it can be one person making a 30-second comment, can be something that imprints in your brain that says, I'm not very smart. So it can be, and from that to fairly serious trauma or neglect or abuse as well. So yeah, most people have subconscious things that it determines a lot of their behavior, it determines a lot of their automatic responses, and a lot of those things that they have absolutely no conscious awareness of. And it's probably the most rewarding thing I do working with people, because you can, if you work on this stuff and you actually really get to the heart of it and overturn the effect of it, it can make an enormous difference to people's lives. So as a coach, I find it probably the most rewarding thing that I do working with people.
That's incredible. One of the things that you said about level 2 with lifestyle, sleep, diet, and exercise, and healthy relationships, and the relationship that you have with yourself, which I recently, well, actually the interview that I did last week, one of the things that we talked about, and I haven't edited the episode yet, so I'm not exactly sure if it was recorded or not, because our conversation went on long after we stopped recording. But one of the things that we talked about was how we treat ourselves, and how so many times, and you mentioned this about things that may have happened in your childhood, in those formative years, that shaped how we view ourselves, and those behaviors continue on into adulthood. And it can actually be beneficial in some cases on the through the lens of somebody that's very nearsighted, in the immediate term, where maybe perfectionism is something that you want out of your employee, or what you want out of yourself, what is required of the job that you're doing, getting things as perfect as possible. But if you're constantly telling yourself that you're an idiot, or you're constantly screwing things up, like, why did you do it like that? Oh, and this negative self-talk can really affect your relationships as well, because if you view yourself as this, you know, person of low quality, then how could anybody else really genuinely care about you? And if they are treating you nice, it's clearly because they want something from you. And it's that kind of mindset that can lead you down the path of dysfunctional relationships, all of that stuff, and a lifestyle that's filled with stress. So I just thought it was interesting that you would bring that up, and I would guess that probably how you coach your people is to change that self-talk, to start telling yourself nice things.
Absolutely. One of my favorite, so we mentioned earlier about Jack Canfield, one of the things that he teaches, which I find as a great exercise to do with people, is basically you talk to yourself in the mirror and tell yourself what a good job you're doing, and that you basically, you say to yourself, I love you. And this is something that if you are if you don't have that thought of I'm capable and lovable and I'm doing a great job, it is extremely uncomfortable. But persisting with things like that over a period of time actually works to that subconscious. So it almost has to become a habit over a period of time to really overturn that. But you're absolutely spot on. So the messages you tell yourself, the default interpretations of things that go around you, makes an enormous difference. And the example that you just gave of if somebody's nice to me, they must want something from me. It's funny, it sounds, my reaction to that is that sounds really sad, but it is, it's one of those default behaviors and default thought patterns that some people have. Yeah, it's interesting. It's and the NLP comes into this too. So going to a lot of that core origin of where these opinions and perceptions came from.
Well, I know from personal experience that telling somebody to look at themselves in the mirror and tell themselves nice things is something that I've heard for quite some time and just thought it was ridiculous and never did it until recently, because I was beating myself up day in and day out. And this amazing woman that I met told me to knock it off and like just try and be nice to yourself. You wouldn't say the stuff that you say to yourself to your daughter, to try and get her to do something better. Like, why do you do it to yourself? And I was like, why don't you talk to yourself like you talk to your daughter and see if things don't get better? And so I took a little bit of time one day and I felt ridiculous doing it. But oh my God, I felt so amazing afterwards. It was ridiculous. I'm like, all these years, I could have felt good.
I've got pretty much the same sort of experience. It's amazing. But doesn't it feel so uncomfortable when you first start to do it?
Oh yeah, feels like, man, I hope nobody's.
Yeah, it's such a simple such a simple exercise, but it is very, very powerful.
Yeah. So I would encourage all the listeners out there, because I know like most everybody has that negative self-talk to some degree, you know, and I would think that my listeners, most of them are veterans and first responders, people in, kind of, these roles of uh, rescuer, or, I'm my role in life is to make things better. When people's lives are upside down, I'm going to go make them better. So that means that I got to be tough, and I can't be, going and talking to myself in the mirror. I need to be tough naturally, because I am. But it just leads to this: when you make a mistake, why am I weak? Why am I this weak man? So yeah, I would encourage people to just try it. It's amazing. Um, I'm curious because I know that you don't just hone in on one industry and that's like your niche. I would imagine you go, I don't know if you're international or not, but within Australia at least, there's a lot of different industries. But is there um, is there a difference in how you approach developing these resilient cultures in different industries?
It's interesting. There are certain similarities regardless of industry. So certain principles around things like the psychological safety and that sort of stuff. But there are certain things that are different in particular industries. So, for example, industries that have a high level of regulation or government control have certain things that go with that. Industries where, like yourself, you're talking about first responders and people who are in either combative or rescuing type roles, there's certain stresses and issues that go with that. And it's another example, things like educational roles, there's certain stresses that go with that. So while there's similarities, there are certain things that are different for different professions. So just say example of the stresses that an accountant faces every day and the things that are going to cause stress in him or her is going to be very different to the things that cause stress in a firefighter. So yes, there are similarities, but there are differences that, depending on the industries and depending on what circumstances or what so what rules, what circumstances, what demands, what timeframes, what carry-on effects of your work are, depending on industries, definitely.
Now, I'm not, well, actually, I'm not familiar with Australian culture at all. I've never been there. I would love to visit one day, but I've yet to travel to Australia, and I only know what I've heard. And I mean, it was when I was in the Navy, I heard things from people that I was serving with that had been to Australia, you know, what it was like in port and that kind of thing. So not really a good, uh, a broad understanding of what culture is like there in Australia. I know that in the United States, there is um, there are organizations, there are industries that are typically male dominated. There's, you know, not a lot of women. And um, one of them is the fire service. And there's challenges in that, and really trying to create a more inclusive culture, because in my studies, and I'm sure you've come across the same information, that regarding emotional intelligence, that it's the most important part of being viewed as an effective leader or being a successful leader is, you know, how well you function, you know, through your use of your emotional intelligence. And um, some of the pieces, and I've talked about this in quite a few different episodes, but with what I've read and what I've found is that women tend to be much better communicators, more empathetic, better at creating and maintaining good relationships, you know, working relationships, that sort of thing. And um, what I've found is that those are the most important parts of good leadership. And those are the parts that women excel in. Yet in male dominated organizations, women aren't valued the same as men are. And I've also found that in organizations where there's this uh, macho type atmosphere, the, you know, rugged masculinity is valued above all else, you know, like we gotta, it, there tends to be a different kind of leadership, and one that doesn't really promote um, high performing teams. So I'm wondering, is it similar there in Australia?
Um, yes. I agree with what you're saying. I would actually add a little bit extra to it. Is even there's industries that are very female dominated, but even those industries a lot of the time at the higher end levels are disproportionately male dominated. So there's a real cultural thing. So for example, I spent a fair bit of my working career in the banking industry. At an operational level, very, very female dominated, where the organization I was in anyway, very female dominated. But that industry, if you go up to managerial levels, there is primarily males. There's some females, but primarily males. Teaching is probably another example of that. Generally, there's a lot more female teachers than males. You go up to your principals and your district leaders and that sort of stuff, there's generally a lot more males than females. So you've made a really good point, I think, in that there needs to be, and there's various reasons for why that happens, but needs to be a shift either in the males developing a lot of those emotional intelligence things, which when people ask me what's one of your core, what's a core characteristic of a successful leader, and my response is generally emotional intelligence. So in terms of from a cultural leadership point of view, so there needs to be a shift in terms of males developing that emotional intelligence and it not being a thing of weakness, and it not being it being something that's just known as this is a feature of a good leader. So that's that side. But there also needs to be, as you've pointed out, a culture of valuing those more sort of traits that females find easier generally than males. Because what's happened in the past, and I think this is changing, what's happened in the past is the females who did end up in those higher managerial, sort of more masculine type roles, and you'd be able to specify whether to say something like a female firefighter, this applies to them as well, that they almost had to adopt male characteristics in order to succeed in that environment. So it was almost not, they themselves didn't value what they brought to the table as authentically being themselves. Is that something that you found?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's really interesting because there's so many different factors that we could talk about that kind of leads to that type of environment. And one of the things that I've talked about, I've taught leadership for quite some time, but when you're trying to change the culture, it's got to be from the bottom up and from the top down, and really working on, but whatever the culture needs to shift to, whoever is leading that organization needs to take on that leadership role and really lead through their actions and embody those values that they're trying to say, this is what is valuable to this organization. But if they don't embody it, it's just lip service.
Absolutely. And the term that I use fairly regularly is leader set the tone. The leader sets the tone for the rest of the team, the organization, whatever. So you're absolutely correct.
Now, I know that we're running short on time, but before we go, I wanted to see if there was anything that we didn't touch on that you'd like to discuss, or something that you feel is very important that we need to leave the listeners with.
Probably the main thing I would say is, from an individual personal resilience point of view, treat yourself as a priority and really work on what's going to improve your quality of your life. and then this has really been highlighted through the last 18 months and everything that the human race has been going through in this 18 months, is that we really do need to do those things that are looking after ourselves at the core for now, but also for the long term. So doing things that are sustainably going to help our well-being. So that's my biggest message, because I see so many people, they're so busy being parents and workers and friends and whatever else, that they and their own well-being becomes a poor last a lot of the times in terms of priorities. So very much encourage people to turn that dynamic around, because you really can't adequately and to your best do a lot of those things, so like your work, your parenting, whatever else, unless you're in a really good space in yourself.
Everything that we've talked about, I would imagine, are things that you discuss in your book. Would I be accurate on that?
Probably not so much. So the book is it's written for organizational leaders, so your CEOs and your C-suite leaders, so CFOs and CIOs and all those people, so organizational leaders. And it is an awareness piece around what I see as the biggest and most common cultural issues that come up with case studies in there and examples. So it doesn't cover the full range of what I'm talking about. I think that's probably about, to give it justice, that's probably about 4 books, which I'll probably get there eventually, but not yet. But this one in particular, yeah, it's a awareness piece for leaders around what are the biggest issues that occur in organizations and cultures, and to really get that insight to the point where they read it and go, okay, that applies to me. Yeah, and then take it from there. So if anyone wants to get hold of the book, if they go onto my website, there's a book link there, basically, where they can find out more about it.
I will have your website linked in the bottom of the show notes. It's jodiwoelkerling.com/book-order.
Yep, or they can just go jodiwoelkerling.com and then there's a book button. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, great. That will be in the show notes. And Jodi, thank you so much for allowing me to interview you. This has been a really great conversation, and I think it will serve the audience well moving forward. So thank you.
Thank you very much for having me on, Dave.
Thank you for listening to this episode of From Embers to Excellence. Please like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Follow me on your favorite podcast platform and visit hollenbachleadership.com for additional content. My goal is and always will be to add value to as many people as possible. So if I can be of any assistance to you or someone you know, please connect with me via email or on one of my social media accounts, linked on the homepage of my website. Remember, our failures don't define us unless we let them, and the only true measure of a leader is the success of their team.